Welcome to the College Admissions Process Podcast presented by Prep Expert. Prep Expert offers live online SAT and ACT courses with the best score guarantees, instructors, and curriculum. Go to prepexpert.com to guarantee your child's success. Welcome to the CAP, the College Admissions Process Podcast. I am your host, John Durante, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Pete Saenz, who's the Assistant Director of Admissions at Boston University. Pete, so glad to have you back. How are you?
I'm doing very well, John. Great to be back. Thanks so much for having us again.
It's an honor and a pleasure. And Pete, my last interview with you and, of course, Boston University was episode 99, which was released back in March of 2023. The episode received one of the most downloads in all of the episodes and was actually shared again as part of our Playback Wednesday series, which we do to highlight the most popular episodes each summer. Since the original release, Pete, what's new at Boston University?
Oh my gosh, we have a lot of updates, John, and congrats on the success of the podcast, especially breaking on into triple digits. Oh my goodness. I would say on our end, kind of from the top down, leadership is going to be the biggest update on our end. Beyond excited to report that our new president, Dr. President Gilliam, President Doctor, I get that mixed up myself, but she was sworn in just a couple weeks ago. Very exciting time here at BU, especially under her tutelage. So we're really
Congratulations.
we're really excited to have her join our community. Woman of color, a lot of higher education experience, public, private. She spoke in our professional development day this summer. So we are really excited, especially to be on her way.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, congrats on that. And what are some of your most popular academic programs that set it apart from other universities? And can you share any unique experiential learning or internship opportunities tied to these programs that help students prepare for careers after graduation?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. So I would say on our end, by head count, by enrollment, we see the most interest, especially as a larger university, a little bit more seasoned in terms of being older as the private sector goes. We'll go ahead and see most of our students enroll in programs in our College of Arts and Sciences. So we are very much so thinking like social sciences, like psychology, I would say physical sciences, like biology. Those tend to be our most popular majors because there's so much you can do with them, research, teaching, but especially getting very in-depth, very quick with something like psychiatry. We also offer neuroscience, biology, pre-medicine has a track there that overlaps very consistently. I would say we'll see a lot of niche interest in my mind in some maybe like harder to come by majors like data sciences, architectural studies, human physiology, and our Sargent College of Rehabilitation and Health Sciences. But I think the biggest, especially with kind of listeners in mind, would be business administration and our Questrom School of Business. So we have 10 undergraduate schools and colleges. Questrom is one. So I love to say, especially with a business college background myself, that we're kind of like that best of both worlds. We have that as part of our opportunities, but not the only part. So students are able to double major, dual degree with that flexibility on our end in mind. But we'll see a lot of interest, especially on Long Island. In business administration, you can specialize, you can concentrate things like international business and real estate. But I like to tell students and parents and counselors that no matter what, you're learning everything you'd ever want or need top to bottom to ever start or run your own business and then get really in-depth really quick.
Well, we know the amazing programs that Boston University has to offer, and I appreciate you highlighting so many of them. But Pete, for students concerned about the cost of attending BU, can you explain the financial aid options available and how BU works with students to make it affordable?
Yeah, and that's a great question as well, John. So on our end, we are very much so affordable in the sense of we are meeting 100% demonstrated need through a newer program called Affordable BU. In that sense, what we focus on in our financial aid process is what we consider and call need-based aid. So we're using information through sources like the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, the College Board CSS profile as well, in our minds to bridge a gap or to meet students and households where they're at based on that information to meet 100% demonstrated need. So that's part of our process. It's a great part, especially with that 100% demonstrated need met, but it's not the only part. We do have a merit-based scholarship review process incorporated within our application review, and that's a December 1st deadline for students in terms of eligibility. It's very, I like to think, automatic in the sense of however you apply to BU, as long as you apply by then, you're in the running for our presidential scholarship, which is our kind of half, as we like to think of it. And then as long as you complete the essay for the trustee scholarship, that's our full cost of tuition and required fees, each of which is renewable all 4 years. So definitely goes a long way to get that application in by December.
Well, I appreciate that. You mentioned the merit-based scholarship deadline of December 1st. So leads me to my next question, which is, Pete, what are the different ways for a student to apply to BU? And of course, I'm talking about early decision, early action, or regular decision. And is there a benefit in applying one way over the other in terms of course, being admitted, but also for being considered for those merit-based scholarships?
That's a great question as well, John. So students are in the kind of same level of competitiveness, I would say, however they apply, as long as they apply with the scholarship component in mind. It's just a matter of making sure they're meeting that December 1st deadline and knowing that on our end, it'll always start with an internal decision to admit and then an escalation for scholarship review. So that might impact the competitiveness as to how the student is admitted. And we can speak to that most definitely, but it is that same level of consideration with scholarships in mind. When we talk about our deadlines, so on our end, our first deadline, I tell seniors, isn't for another week and a half. So I know that's a lot of time for a high school senior, but it's going to be next week, Friday. It's going to be November 1st. That's going to be our early decision deadline. We'll also have our early decision round two deadline and then our regular decision deadline. Technically not until next year, so plenty of time there as well, but
Hmm.
it has a tendency to sneak up on some seniors every now and again. And that's going to be January 6th. So on our end, we have two rounds of what's called early decision, and then we have our one round of regular decision. Regular decision is typically where we'll see the bulk of our application pool, the most applications make their way to us from. But early decision, it's a smaller applicant pool, especially with that big commitment, that big decision in mind. So the trade off is a little bit of a quicker turnaround, usually right around 6 weeks.
Fantastic. And I have to mention that I read that your retention rate, Pete, is an astonishing 94%, which of course represents the percentage of students that return to BU after that freshman year. And I know that BU is a large urban campus and a great city, obviously. So, how do students find their sense of community at BU, and what support systems are in place to help them transition from the many high schools that they're coming from?
Oh, it's a great question as well, John. So I think on our end, what we do best, if I'm being biased and honest, would be
Hmm.
our residential life piece, especially with that city dynamic in mind. I think it depends on the student and it depends on the city and especially that college or university's campus. But being an urban environment goes a long way, but still has a lot of intimidating factors for a student that might not be as familiar with the city. So on our end, being a residential community, having all that city access, but a traditional college campus, residential campus with residence halls and dormitories to circle back to at the end of the day goes a long way. I think with that, what we're excited to share is that we are requiring first year students to live on campus, which tends to be pretty popular because there's so much great data out there that shows students are not just more likely, but practically guaranteed to be successful, stick that landing from high school or secondary school to college or university, and then hit that ground running. So it goes a long way to be right here on campus, cut down that commute to go ahead and get into classes, and then being involved in our campus community, most definitely. I would say that's probably the biggest one. And especially thinking forwardly in terms of like upperclassmen years or forward thinking, excuse me, we do guarantee housing all the way. So students always have that space to call their own all throughout their 4 years, 8 academic semesters. Even if they might take a break from living on campus and go ahead and participate in something like a research opportunity or an internship opportunity, maybe even a study abroad as well. So I think that's something as like a balancing act goes very well and goes great. And I'd love to plug our housing office, especially with the job well done there.
Hmm. Well, I love that you talk about how you're a residential campus, of course, in an urban environment. I think that's great and appeals to so many students out there, obviously, and how you require students in that first year to definitely live on campus, but that it's available to them for the 4 years. So, all of that is very important in terms of helping to build that sense of community, which, of course, attributes to that 94% retention rate. So, I know you have a lot to offer in terms of supports, Pete, but what other academic and personal support services does BU offer to help all students, regardless of their learning needs, achieve their full potential and navigate challenges during their college experience?
That's a great question. Oh my goodness, John. So I would say kind of starting with that lead in, I love to mention, then emphasize that we're very much so a teaching institution. So we are faculty taught. 90% of our professors have a PhD within their areas of expertise. Very much so, I would say, big an opportunity in a good way, but still small in terms of feel is another balancing act on our end. So average student to faculty ratio is about 10 to 1. Average class size is about 30. So on our end, we never want to be too big. Always want to make sure students know their professors and are actively continuing those conversations, from class with office hours, with programs like, again, to circle back on residence life, we have a faculty in residence program where faculty members are even more accessible to students, but can help them in any way that they need help or want help, answer questions on a one-on-one basis, help them in terms of if they might be looking for any research assistance in terms of their research, if they might be looking for something like an internship opportunity as well. So I'd say that's the biggest one on our end, especially being faculty taught. Academically as well, I would also say academic advisors are a great resource, a fantastic opportunity for students to make sure they are on track to graduate, potentially even early, not that there's any rush, but all the
Hmm.
while taking the right classes in the right sequences, no matter their major or majors. If they have a minor, a concentration, or a specialty, they're taking all the right classes in the proper sequence to make sure that they're on track in terms of their program's completion. I would say that would be a big one. When it comes to like outside of academic resources, student support services, we have a lot, most definitely. So I would say our Newberry Center is our first generation office here on campus. So we're still classified as a first generation forward institution. Typically about 20% of our incoming students are first gen themselves, first in their households to attend a secondary institution, which we'd love to be a part of. But I think Newberry is great, especially about answering questions before they're asked, understanding that students don't know what they don't know in that capacity. So they're a great resource, especially when students are here on campus. They go and make sure students are landing on their feet, very resource referral driven, knowing who to go to for what types of questions, where their office is, but also that friendly face to say hello to and check in with on campus as well. The biggest one I would say here recently as well would be we just opened up our LGBTQIA resource center here on campus. So beautiful space, most definitely. They're hosting and hitting the ground running. It feels like this semester. It feels like a different event almost every other day. So
Hmm.
they are very much so making up for any lost time in terms of being a great advocate for students, but especially being a proud campus partner here.
Well, that's terrific. I mean, there's so much for every single student, obviously. And I love how you talked about that it's a big school, but it gives a very small feel with that 10-to-1 ratio in terms of student to faculty. And you talked about your class size being at about 30. And I also love the fact that you talked about 20% of your students are first gen, which I think is terrific. And of course, you know, Pete, that I always put the Office of Undergraduate Admissions and some other information in the show notes. If you have any links to any of the programs that you mentioned or anything else, just of course send it to me and we'll put it in the show notes for the students and parents. And so, speaking of the students and parents, a lot of them that are listening, they want to hear about that application review process. So, Pete, could you explain your holistic review process and what specific experiences the admissions team looks for when reviewing those applications?
That's a great question as well. Oh my gosh. So I love that word, holistic, to kind of
Hmm.
kick things off there. And I'm 10 years in admissions. BU is my fourth institution. So that is very much so a common word in these types of conversations. So I love to specify what that means here at BU is everything. We're looking at every word of every sentence, every paragraph on every page, absolutely everything before a final decision is made with a board of admissions. So I myself am one of the about 30 members of our professional staff that sit on the board of admissions that we review applications with, and also serve as a primary reader or a territory manager for a assigned part of not just the state, not just the city, but the country and even the world, right? So on our end, it's very much so a thoughtful, comprehensive, and contextual process, applying everything we know as being the arguable experts in our assigned areas, having traveled, but also stay in contact with high school administrators and guidance counseling, college counseling staff. So on our end, what the biggest standouts are, in my experience, that really help students go ahead and make the most of the process. I would say authenticity, passion, excitability. That's a personal one as a pretty excitable guy
Hmm.
myself. Uh, Really, those go a long way, making the process their own, right? I speak to essays a lot of times as to sometimes the hardest part of the essay writing process is coming up with a topic. But once you do, it's like pen to paper, you can't stop
Hmm.
yourself. Uh, I would say that tends to be the biggest part. How we help students throughout that process and make the most of that process is giving them different ways to shine, different opportunities to really make the most of. So procedurally, we'll go ahead and present the student to the board of admissions. When we're putting our notes in as the primary reader and territory manager in the initial files review, we'll go ahead and kind of sequentially in a particular order and target certain parts of the application first. Understand some things are more impactful. Academics tends to be the biggest point of impact, the most impactful, because there's so much time. That's the most information in any part of the application. But a lot of us, myself included, will purposely read the student's essay before anything else comes into play, so we can hear their authentic voice and then go from there accordingly. But I would say really making the most of this process for students is kind of knowing the ins, knowing the outs, being comfortable asking questions, and then how to maximize that school's process. So we talked a little bit about our ways to apply to BU. Early decisions, a great option. Hence, we have 2 rounds of it, but it's not the only option. And it's a big decision that we never force students to. So we want to make sure they're making the right decision for them. And we're always happy to help with that.
Well, Pete, you touched upon a lot of pieces of the application, so we need to unpackage it just a little bit again for those students, parents, and college counselors that are listening out there. So, with BU being a test optional school, Pete, how does that impact your application review process? And are there specific instances where submitting scores is actually encouraged?
Definitely. So we can start there and work backwards. I would encourage any student, wherever they're applying, even if it's not BU, if you have a perfect score, you got to apply with that perfect score. You're going to ruin the curve for potentially some other folks, but good on you. We wish you the best there. I think from that point, it gets a little bit, I'd say, dicier, but more of a conversation mate. Definitely, I would say. Maybe not as dicey in the sense of when you're looking at everything, there's always that thorough, comprehensive contextual review process like we were speaking to. So I think a lot of folks might have maybe a misconception that we just look at a GPA or we just look at a test score in the question example and call it coach. Not the case at all. We're looking at everything before that final decision is made. So for something like the standardized test score, that's part of the process, but it's not the only part of the process. And in the example with test optional, it doesn't even have to be part of the process. I like to tell folks that I work with that it's kind of like a thanks but no thanks, not a trick question at all. We'll ask students on the application very directly if they want to apply with or without the inclusion of the test scores. And they can say thanks but no thanks if they want to apply test optional. And that's where that conversation ends. With that, and again, with that review process, we're still spending the same amount of time, effort, and energy reviewing that student's application. But with that, we're taking a closer look at the other materials that we do have in place of test scores. So we spoke to academics, we spoke to the essay. Those come in kind of a little bit more closely in the review process there. But overall, I would say students really, when they're thinking about whether or not to apply with test scores, there's a good feeling, a good vibe, a good aura of going ahead and walking out of the test center even before those scores are received and knowing that I'm probably going to want to apply with those scores, but let me wait for the score report to come out, then make that informed decision, especially with all the other materials. It might be a balloon pulling the student up with everything side by side. It might be an anchor, maybe weighing them down, maybe not the strongest part of the application, but we don't have a preferred score or an average range having been test optional these past couple of years and being approved for test optional as it stands presently up until the spring 2026 entry term, and still continuing that conversation to see how much longer we will be test optional, if we will be test optional in the future past that point. So I would say looking at everything side by side, thinking about everything side by side is the best way to make that informed decision for sure. And I'll speak to personal experience. I was not the strongest test taker. I can personally guarantee any listener that your test scores are definitely double what mine were. Final count, senior year of high school, more than likely triple if we're being 100% transparent. And that's okay. That is how and why test optional, test blind, depending on the institution, is such a popular option, especially nowadays.
Well, we appreciate that. And I appreciate you also saying how you're looking at, trends since you've gone test optional. Could you shed some light in terms of what specifically are you looking for? Are you looking at graduation rates, the types of courses that students are taking that have gone test optional? Any insight would be greatly appreciated.
Oh, absolutely. So on our end, we're going ahead and presenting by school group, reading by school group based on those deadlines we were speaking to. So a big part of that process, as we mentioned with the primary reader and territory manager responsibilities, is we need to know exactly what we're looking at. So we're going to go ahead and factor in different components that make that school unique. If we're thinking about 2 different schools side by side, even if they're next door neighbors, they could be radically different, drastically different between being a public institution and private institution, between educational philosophies. Grade scales would be another one I use from personal experience as well. I went to 2 different high schools in the sense of an A- at one school might be a B+ at another. So it's really helpful to know that. You mentioned course selection and what's available, rigor, as we sometimes call it in RN. That is hugely important because we need to know what the student, had access to, what was offered by the school. So we want to understand how and where they challenge themselves. You applaud them for classes that they took that were a little bit more rigorous, not hold them at any sort of disadvantage for not taking a class that they didn't have access to. So we really need to know exactly what we're looking at there. And that, in my experience, and especially with academics being the biggest part of the review process, most impactful on our end, is going to be where and how the student can shine most in that academic review. I think it's a fine line as well, in the sense of very easily a student can feel maybe overwhelmed, maybe challenged, maybe put on the spot in terms of pressure with classmates and things like that in mind. So I think it's important for students to stay in their comfort zone, but not be afraid to challenge themselves, for sure. And again, full transparency, my first AP class was my last AP class.
Mhm.
So I would say it's more than okay for a student to go ahead and try an AP, maybe try another one the year after that. Or maybe if they didn't enjoy that type of AP, try a different AP instead of the social science, a physical science potentially. But all the while, make the most of that process.
Well, we appreciate that, Pete. And of course, a lot of talk about the academic side of the review process. And of course, the transcript is obviously a key component in terms of that academic review portion of the application, especially if you go and test optional. So, Pete, how does BU weigh course rigor versus the GPA in the admissions process? And how does this vary based on a student's intended major?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. So on our end, we'll go ahead and focus on that performance, that cumulative academic performance. When we talk about something like GPA, I like to say it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. We don't know what's beneath the surface, but we want to know how we got there. Algebra, math example, we're solving for X. So we want to understand exactly what we're
Hmm.
looking at there. And with those different schools in mind, right? Is it a 4.0, a 5.0? I think Florida schools are sometimes on a 9.0. So
Hmm.
it can radically make a difference there for sure. But I would say on our end, we're going to go ahead and again see what's offered by the high school, see those rigor levels, and then go ahead and make those informed decisions based on that. So when we're looking at course rigor versus GPA, I think it's a really tough question for a student to maybe think about or ask about as to, oh, is it better to maybe have, a C in an AP class or an A in a regular level class or an honors level class? And again, that circles back to the student's comfort level and being comfortable challenging themselves, course correcting if necessary, for sure. But I would say overall, that's a big part of our review process, most definitely, is knowing exactly what we're looking at and how we got there. And that gives us a lot to talk about, especially as those primary readers and territory managers.
Well, we appreciate that. But I know there's students and parents thinking, so what is the answer? The C in the AP course or the A in the regular course, Pete? So come on,
Sure.
I'm gonna ask you to answer one way or the other.
I would personally, from my own experience with the AP, I would advocate the C in the AP
Hmm.
because on that note, at least you get some comfort level, you get some familiarity. Hopefully, you get a couple of college credits. I'm speaking to
Hmm.
we have a database that's regularly updated based on different AP classes that are added, and I think getting that testing familiarity, even if you might not get the best score, but getting that familiarity goes a long way to part of that experience. I think, in my experience, having those two high schools under my belt, that's kind of where I lean.
Well, I appreciate that, Pete. And I think it goes back to what we always talk about in the podcast episodes that you want to look at what's available to you students and build ramps, right? Challenge yourself appropriately to your ability, right? For some people, they can take 5 APs. Some could take more. Some take maybe two, and that's fantastic. That's fine. Whatever it is that's best for you, just follow your own path. So, Pete, what are some common pitfalls students should avoid when writing their personal statement? And can you share examples of how a unique personal story really elevated an application?
Sure. I would say some pitfalls, feeling like they have to write about a particular topic. I would say there's a lot of shared life experience, especially in the senior and high school demographic. So feeling like they have to talk about something, I'm just thinking not in a bad way at all about some of the most common topics that we'll read about in terms of essays. Might be like an athletic injury, might be something like a family loss, might be something, in terms of trying out, not making the team, and how that was a formative experience. And there's nothing wrong with having those under that life experience belt. But I would say a lot of times students might feel pressured to write about that because other students are. So if that's the case, I would say really make that essay writing process your own. Speak to your passions. Say something about you that nobody can say about themselves. Or with that example in mind, if that's what you're most passionate about, how can you go ahead and say it in a way that nobody can say about it themselves, right? So I would say that can be sometimes a pitfall. Sometimes that, again, that challenge being, how do I decide on a topic? How do I make the most of my entire 17, 18 years on this planet in a single essay? right? So I think that can be some pressure that we try to avoid as much as we can wherever we can. I would say on our end, really making the most of the process. To circle back there, there are different essays. I know we've got on our end a supplementary essay. We've got a trustee scholarship essay we were speaking to a little bit earlier. So I think students are well within their right to not just include one topic over and over in different perspectives at that, but to have a couple of different topics. And you are welcome to recycle those. Senior year is a busy time. So we want to make sure you're making the most of it. You can reuse those essays at other schools and other institutions, most definitely. But all in all, making the most of that process in each individual component, I'd say. Some pitfalls I would say to try and avoid. Knowing the deadlines is, I think, the most beneficial way to maximize this process, whether it's a digital calendar, physical calendar, post-its, some sort of outlined way to know exactly when each application is due for each school. And as much as we'll try to overlap and keep it consistent, it can be very, very school specific in certain examples. But really just kind of knowing each school's individual process, I think, is a great way to make sure you don't get a pitfall.
Well, those are definitely great pieces of advice, Pete, and some great examples. And as you know, of course, some colleges and universities, of course, like BU, ask applicants to answer supplemental essay questions. Pete, what are you looking for from the supplemental essays that are not easily found elsewhere on a student's overall application?
Yeah, that's a great question too, John. So I would say community, I think, is the best one word answer I can give with those in mind. So with that in mind, we have two supplementary essay questions. Only one needs to be complete. Only one can be completed through the common application. And the way I like to explain them is one is kind of like why Boston University? How do you put that U in BU, puns intended? But overall, we're looking to see what here at Boston University put that on the students. Sorry, we're going to go ahead and ask why Boston University, right? How do you put that U in BU? What was it about Boston University that put us on your college list as a prospective applicant, right? So on our end, it is really getting to where and how we connect with a student, how they see themselves being the most successful U at BU, right? Or them at BU. So on our end, it was really how the student has done the research, sees where they're going to go ahead and fit in at BU. And that's that community advocacy that goes a huge way on our end. The other question is how and where the students made an impact in their community and upbringing, paraphrasing both questions, both prompts. But really, there's no wrong answer. If the student feels more comfortable sharing what they're excited about, passionate about, and how they got excited and passionate about it in their community, be it the school, the outside community, surrounding areas, really we're looking to understand and advocate through both of those questions how and where they're going to be making BU a better place and strengthening our community on campus. What are they bringing to the table? Are they adding in a certain part of our community, or are they going ahead in the first perspective and that trailblazer, right? So we want to understand better exactly where and how they'd be fitting in and adding to our community.
Well, we appreciate that. And we talk a lot about demonstrating interest, right? And I'm going to come back to you in terms of whether or not you track that. But even if a school doesn't track demonstrating interest, I think it's very important to visit,
Sure.
participate in virtual events, perhaps even read the mission and philosophy of the university so that when you're answering the supplemental question, for example, why Boston University, hopefully you're better equipped to really demonstrate your understanding of the university, why specifically you see yourself there, and frankly, how are you going to contribute? Would you agree with that at all, Pete, or not?
I would, in a sense of, do we track it? Yes. How do we use that? Would be a kind of a continued conversation. So on our, we do track demonstrated interest before the application process. So we love to welcome students, visitors, families to campus all throughout the year. We're really excited about having them on campus, showing what we offer and how we offer it. But having visited campus virtually or in person, gone on a tour, engaged with your admissions representative, all of these things when we talk about that demonstrated interest umbrella are not going to positively impact overall that admissions decision, right? So I think it's helpful to kind of manage that expectation and clarify that in advance. I would go a little bit deeper in saying that it's not always students can visit campus. I
Right.
think travel costs add up. It's not always convenient, especially with a senior schedule in mind and outside extracurricular commitments. That's how and why we understand that. But on our end, it's something that is incredibly helpful when we think about things like our marketing plans. We're trying to, similarly to what we've mentioned, answer questions before they've been asked. So we want to get as much good information about BU out there as humanly possible. I'm thinking of school visits, going ahead and planning travel, for all throughout the year, in the sense of we are kind of trying to go where those questions and those students are, right? Those future terriers are, right? So we want to understand where and how we're seeing the most interest on our end to meet the students where they are, especially more conveniently with senior year in mind. We love to engage in conversations. We'd love to answer questions, right? But it's not something that a student has to ask as part of the review process. We won't have access to that information as part of our review. And then I would say on our end, just kind of speaking of what we don't do on purpose, interviews. We don't have an
Hmm.
interview component as part of our process. So on our end, it really comes down to those application materials as the basis for the decision making.
Well, we appreciate that. And for listeners who may not be familiar with it, Pete, the Common Data Set, can you explain what it is and how prospective students and their families can use this resource to better understand key aspects, for example, of Boston University, such as admissions and financial aid data, along with student demographics?
Yeah, that's a great question as well, John. So I think it's a helpful tool. I would caution students in just using that information as the basis for decision making. I think there are a lot of layers, right, that go into the decision making process, navigating the college applications and things like that. But I think Common Data Set is great about streamlining as many different types of schools as possible, from students casting a wide net and getting either down to one number or close to one number. Right. So I think it's very helpful. I think it's a great resource. It's a great tool. But again, understanding that different schools are going to be offering different types of experience that might not be quantifiable.
Hmm.
Right. So I think that's really important to take into consideration there. But anything and everything from the size of the institution, right? It might be a larger institution, it might be a smaller institution, it might be a medium or fun sized institution, right?
Hmm.
But it's going to be really relative in terms of what that number in that example means when it comes to that institution and that prospective student experience, right? I think program offering would be another one as well. Number of academic majors, how many undergraduate schools and colleges, right? A lot of students know what they want to study, have always known, not going to change, might update in terms of an additional major, maybe a program or concentration specialty, things like that. But on our end, knowing that flexibility piece outside or between those numbers that students can know, but they don't have to. We'll have
Hmm.
30% of our students typically come in undecided. You don't have to declare a major up until your junior year here at BU.
Right.
70% of students, we had a phenomenal training with our College of Arts and Sciences and most of our colleges this summer. I'm thinking of them as the largest college here at BU because out of our 300 programs of study, they've got about 80. So they're the biggest. So they've
Hmm.
got more of the data in the sense of they see about 70% of their students change their major at least once, which is normal. I changed my major myself a
Right.
couple times at that
Hmm.
to even out the other folks, right? Average wise. But I think those numbers are helpful, but knowing what those numbers mean respective to each institution and especially those student experiences there.
Well, those are great points, very important. And, if anyone is interested, you basically just search Common Data Set,
Mhm.
insert the name of the school, and it's an interesting report to look at. But Pete, you did a great job just in terms of breaking it down and how to look at the different data and things to be mindful of while reviewing that. So this has been an awesome conversation. And so, Pete, before I get to that last question, I really just need to ask, is there a question that I didn't ask or a topic that I didn't bring up that you'd like to share with our listeners now?
I would love, hopefully, I'm not going to be the first, but just to reinforce that we have a new Long Island and Queens area representative this year. In terms of, I have loved every second of being on the island, I like to say. But on our end, we go where the job is, I go where I'm sent, is the way I put it. So I unfortunately have concluded my time in Long Island,
So
excuse
I'm not
me.
going to see you here, Pete. I'm not going to see you on Long Island.
I'm hoping to cover as many events as I can. So never say never. I'm not that easy to get rid of, John. But on our end, Sydney Houston within our office is the new Long Island representative and Queens representative. She's fantastic. She's a BU alum. She
Awesome.
is phenomenal as she's actually showcased her projects from the College of Fine Arts here at BU on campus, which was great to see as from a student experience. She was a phenomenal resource and still is to this day. But as I was onboarding as a current student at that time, so I'm unbelievably excited to introduce her, welcome her to Long Island, especially. I would say I know the podcast has grown tremendously over these past
Oh,
couple
thank
of
you.
years, John. Yeah, so congrats on that success. And if
Thank you.
we have any listeners that are not in New York or not even in the US, we have a great resource website online, bu.edu/admissions/ visit us is our main admissions visit page. And if you add another / in the word staff, that's the Meet the Board of Admissions page. And it's sorted out
Right.
by country, it's alphabetized by states here in the US. So you get to, go ahead and see exactly who that point of contact is if you have ever any questions and how to get a hold of them and reach out directly there. But that's it. That's the biggest, I would say. Definitely excited to welcome Sydney for sure.
Well, that's awesome. Definitely welcome to Sydney Houston, who, of course, is covering Queens and Long Island, which is, as the name implies, very long. But also, I appreciate all of the links that you mentioned. And again, just provide them to me and we'll make them available in the show notes for the students and the parents. So, Pete, this has been awesome. Unfortunately, it does lead us to that last question, which is, what are your top 3 pieces of advice that you would provide students and their parents getting ready for the college admissions process?
Yeah, oh my gosh. I have to give credit where credit is due on the 99th episode. I think I quoted my mom and my dad because I couldn't between the two. So last time I went ahead and said, bloom where you're planted. My mom's a gardener. She'll tell you she's a master gardener. She's the gardener. That's some life advice that has never steered me wrong. Bloom where you're planted. Remember why you're there. Was my dad's piece of advice when I was in college. So it's okay
Great
to
advice.
enjoy the experience. You'll land on your feet no matter what. But that's what I said last time. So this time I've been telling students, especially recently, as we're familiarizing ourselves with the application process, different types of schools out there, 3 pieces of advice. Nobody's gone through this before. On that side, we go through this every year. And even sometimes for us, it's a little bit of a change up year to year, right? So it's okay to be nervous, intimidated, stressed out. And, some people are internalizing that. Some folks are externalizing that, that's okay. But everybody is feeling the same thing. Nobody's gone through this process before, I think is very important there. I would also go ahead and say that no matter what, you're going to get in. You're going to get into a school, right? And you're going to land on your feet, especially with that bloom while you're planted piece. And so all in all, it's stressful, but it's worth it. And I like to kind of stay upbeat, especially with senior year, that I say it's the most fun you never want to have again, right? But once you're through it, you're through it. So I'm hoping students are having a good senior year, making time for themselves, definitely prioritizing self-care, emotional well-being, mental health especially, but all the while staying strong in terms of their classes, enjoying the experience and the ride as well.
Well, those are tremendous pieces of advice, Pete. Obviously, BU is so fortunate to have you, as were we, on this podcast episode. Even though you're not going to be in Queens and Long Island, I want you to come back in the future, Pete. You promise?
I will, I promise. I'm boosting Mario's Pizza every chance I get. That was a fantastic spread you had at that spring ferry, John. I'm not that easy to get rid of, I promise.
Pete, you're awesome again. Thank you so much. And to everyone out there, good luck with the college search. Take care all and best wishes. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The CAP, the College Admissions Process Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please don't forget to tell a friend and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. I am your host, John Durante, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of The CAP. Thank you for listening to the College Admissions Process Podcast presented by Prep Expert. Prep Expert offers live online SAT and ACT courses with the best score guarantees, instructors, and curriculum. Go to prepexpert.com to guarantee your child's success.